A Tale of Two Sisters, my half-sister Ashley, is what you would call a force of nature. Or, to be more precise, she is what my own dearly departed and deeply sarcastic mother would have called a Category 5 narcissist. She is 28, years old, beautiful, ambitious, and possesses a profound and a deeply unwavering belief that the entire universe is merely a backdrop for the far more interesting movie of her own life. And for the past 6 months, that movie has been a lavish, high-budget, increasingly tyrannical production titled Ashley's Perfect Wedding. I am 68, and I am her maid of honor. The 40-year age gap between us is the result of my father's rather spectacular midlife crisis, a story involving a divorce, a red convertible, and a second, much younger wife who had, to everyone's surprise, given him Ashley, his second chance baby. I was already in college when she was born. I was more of an aunt, or even a grandmotherly figure than a sister. After our father passed away and Ashley's own mother moved to Florida, that maternal role had only intensified. I loved her. I adored her. And I had, for her entire spoiled and deeply self-absorbed life, been her greatest and her most foolish enabler, which is how I found myself, a 68-year-old retired art professor with a bad back and a deep and an abiding love for a quiet, sensible life, standing in the middle of a Las Vegas nightclub at 2 o'clock in the morning, wearing a pink satin sash that said Team Bride, and trying to convince a bouncer that my sister's bachelorette party absolutely positively needed another magnum of overpriced champagne. My partner, Robert, a kind, gentle, and deeply sensible man who had been my rock for the past 10 years, had thought I was insane. "You know you don't have to do this, Helen," he had said as I was packing for the Vegas trip. "You are allowed to say no." "I know," I'd sighed. "But it's her wedding, it's her special day. I want to be supportive." "There is a difference," he had said, his voice a low, gentle rumble of reason, between being supportive and being a hostage. He was, of course, right, but I had gone anyway, 'cause I loved her. And because I had not yet reached my own personal and deeply, deeply necessary breaking point, underscore the Bridezilla chronicles the planning of Ashley's wedding to her fiancé, a handsome and a deeply, deeply bland private equity manager named Chad, had been a masterclass in escalating and increasingly absurd acts of bridal tyranny. It was not a celebration of love. It was a military campaign, and Ashley was its ruthless and its slightly unhinged commanding officer. It had all started with the venue. Ashley had decided, with the unshakable conviction of a religious zealot, that the wedding had to be at a specific and a ridiculously exclusive vineyard in Napa Valley, a place called the Serenity Estate. It was beautiful. It was also booked solid for the next 3 years. To Ashley was not an obstacle. It was a personal insult from the universe. Ski Hot, for 2 weeks, waged a campaign of such relentless and such deeply emotional warfare against the poor venue manager that the woman had finally, in a fit of what I can only assume was pure, unadulterated desperation, called her to say there had been a last-minute cancellation. Ashley had, of course, seen this not as a victory for her own monstrously entitled behavior, but as a sign from God that this wedding was meant to be. Then came the guest list. She had tried to institute a strict no babies rule, reasoning, as she had explained it to me over the phone, was that a crying baby would completely ruin the aesthetic and the auditory landscape of her carefully curated ceremony. This had become a problem when our cousin Emily, who had just had a newborn, had, quite reasonably, said she would not be able to come. But she has to come. Ashley had wailed. "She's in all of my childhood photos. It will look weird if she isn't there." "Well, Ashley," I had said in my most gentle and my most reasonable tone, "perhaps you could make an exception for family." "No," she had insisted. "The rule is the rule. It's my special day." She had, in the end, been convinced to relent. but only after I had personally agreed to pay for a private on-site nanny to watch our cousin's baby in a separate, soundproofed room. 100 yards away from the main event, the Bachelorette party in Las Vegas had been a new circle of hell. It had involved matching, custom-made, and deeply unflattering pink sequin jumpsuits, a private table at a nightclub where the music was so loud it made my teeth ache, and a bill that was roughly equivalent to the gross domestic product of a small developing nation. I had, of course, been expected to foot a significant portion of that bill. "You're the maid of honor, Helen," Ashley had chirped as she had handed me the receipt. "It's your job to make sure I have the time of my life." I had paid. I had smiled. And I had, with every new and more outrageous demand, felt a small, crucial piece of my own quiet dignity begin to erode, underscore the silver. Made the one thing in my life that was not up for negotiation, the one thing that was entirely and unapologetically my own, was my hair. I'd been going gray since my late 30s. For 20 years, I had dutifully and with a great deal of chemical assistance held back the tide. I had spent a fortune and hundreds of hours of my life sitting in a salon chair, the acrid smell of ammonia in the air, maintaining the facade of a youthful and a deeply inauthentic brunette. And then, one day, about 10 years ago, after my first husband had passed away, I had just stopped. I had looked at my reflection in the mirror, at the pale, sad woman with the fake brown hair, and I had made a decision. I was done with the artifice. I was done with pretending to be someone I was not. I was ready to be my own, true and 60-year-old self. The process of growing it out had been long, and it had been awkward. But the result had been a revelation. My hair had grown in not a dull, mousy gray, but a brilliant, thick, and a wonderfully, beautifully silver white. It was my crown. It was my history. It was a statement that I was a woman who had lived, who had loved, who had lost, and who had not just survived, but had thrived. I wore it long, almost to my waist, a glorious, shining, and deeply, deeply unapologetic silver mane. It was my signature. It was me. And it was, I would soon discover, a major and a deeply offensive problem for my sister's wedding. Aesthetic. Underscore the dress. The final and the most humiliating of my pre-wedding trials by fire was the bridesmaid dress. The color palette for the wedding, as Ashley had informed us in a 20-page PDF-style guide she had emailed to the entire wedding party, was a very specific and a deeply, deeply unforgiving shade of blush pink she had named Bashful Peony. The final dress fitting was held at a chic and a ridiculously overpriced bridal boutique in Napa a week before the wedding. I was there, along with the 4 other bridesmaids, a collection of Ashley's bubbly, 20-something, and deeply sycophantic sorority sisters. The dress was a monstrosity. It was a floor-length column of the aforementioned Bashful Peony taffeta, a fabric that made a quiet, rustling sound like a bag of potato chips every time you moved. It was sleeveless, which was a problem for a 60-year-old woman's arms, and it had a series of strange, architectural ruffles on the chest that made me look like a sad and a slightly deflated flamingo. I stood in front of the 3-way mirror, a vision of pastel horror, and I just stared at my own deeply, deeply ridiculous reflection. The 4 other bridesmaids, all of them young and tan and beautiful, looked like goddesses. I looked like the world's oldest and most uncomfortable cupcake. Ashley circled me, her head cocked. Her eyes narrowed in a look of intense, critical concentration. She said. "It's lovely, sweetie," I lied, the taffeta rustling around me like a fire hazard. "It's not the dress," she said, her eyes still narrowed. "The dress is perfect." She walked closer, and she reached out and touched a long silver strand of my hair, a look of profound and a deeply, deeply troubling thought on her face. "It's the hair," she'd finally said, a quiet and a deeply ominous declaration. I had laughed, a nervous, uncertain sound. "What's wrong with my hair?" "Nothing," she'd said, a little too quickly. "It's beautiful. You know? I love your hair. It's just—" She'd trailed off, a look of pained artistic torment on her face. I did not press her. I did not want to know. I just wanted to get out of that dress and out of that store. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I had passed the final, humiliating test. I had agreed to wear the dress. The trials were over. I had been a good and a supportive and a deeply, deeply accommodating maid of honor. I had no idea. Of course, the worst, the most insulting, and the most beautifully, wonderfully, and liberatingly infuriating demand of all was yet to come. The final countdown the week before the wedding, the entire bridal party was summoned to the Serenity Estate in Napa Valley. It was less of an invitation and more of a mandatory deployment. We were Ashley's soldiers, and this was our final week of boot camp before the main event. The estate was, I had to admit, a place of breathtaking and a deeply, deeply intimidating beauty. It was a sprawling Tuscan-style villa perched on a hill, surrounded by a sea of perfectly manicured grapevines, the air thick with the sweet, boozy scent of ripening grapes and old money. But the beauty of the place was a thin, fragile veneer over the ugly and the increasingly tyrannical reality of my sister's bridal mania. Ashley, in the final days leading up to her wedding, had transformed from a slightly self-absorbed young woman into a full-blown microscopic and a deeply unhinged dictator. Her fiancé, Chad, a man whose personality seemed to consist entirely of a firm handshake and a collection of expensive polo shirts, had wisely made himself scarce, claiming a series of urgent, last-minute business meetings. He had, in effect, abandoned his troops on the beaches of Normandy, leaving the rest of us to face the full and the increasingly unmedicated force of his bride's obsession. Our lives for that week were governed by a laminated, 12-page, minute-by-minute itinerary that Ashley had created herself. There were mandatory 7 a.m. yoga sessions on the lawn to ensure we were all radiating a calm and a photogenic energy. There were scheduled 2-hour blocks of time for spontaneous, candid-style photo shoots by the infinity pool. She had even, I kid you not, tried to put us all on a strict pre-wedding cleanse. A horrifying diet that consisted entirely of lemon water, cayenne pepper, and a deep and abiding sense of existential despair. We, the other bridesmaids, and I had staged a quiet and a deeply necessary rebellion against that particular edict, a rebellion that had involved a clandestine, late-night trip to an In-N-Out burger, an act of treason for which we all would have surely been court-martialed if she had found out. The tyranny of the ascetic. She was not planning a wedding. She was planning a photo shoot, a week-long, immersive, and deeply expensive content creation event. Her conversations were not about her love for Chad or her hopes for their future. They were about the visual narrative, the color story, and the brand consistency of the event. She spoke of her own wedding as if it were a new product she was launching. Her tyranny was focused on the smallest, most insignificant of details. She had a full-blown, screaming, and a deeply embarrassing meltdown on the first day because the rental company had delivered chairs for the reception that were crew, instead of the oyster shell white she had specified in her 200-page design brief. She had at one point threatened to fire her wedding planner, a woman with the patience of a saint and the haunted, 1,000-yard stare of a war veteran over the placement of a floral arrangement. I asked the maid of honor, and as the only person in the world she was still marginally afraid of, was tasked with the role of her primary and her deeply exhausted emotional support animal. I spent my days listening to her frantic, tearful monologues about the thread count of the tablecloths, about the font on the menu cards, bowed her deep in her abiding fear that the sunset on her wedding day might be a little more orange than the apricot hue she had envisioned. I was patient. I was supportive. I told myself that this was just the stress of the event. I told myself that this was not the real Ashley. I told myself that after the wedding, my sweet, funny, and occasionally thoughtful little sister would return. But on the Tuesday afternoon before the wedding, 3 days before the main event, she came to me with a new and a final and a deeply, deeply unforgivable problem. And I was the problem. Underscore the aesthetic consultation she had summoned me. Via a formal text message to the bridal suite for what she had called a private aesthetic consultation. The suite was a massive, sun-drenched room filled with a chaotic and a deeply expensive explosion of wedding paraphernalia. Her magnificent and her ridiculously large wedding dress was on a mannequin in the corner, a silent, white, and a deeply judgmental goddess. She was not alone. Her wedding photographer, a hip young man with a man bun and a look of deep artistic seriousness, was with her. They were looking at a series of color swatches that were spread out on the large, king-size bed. "Helen," she began, her voice a low, serious, and a deeply, deeply practiced thing. "We have a problem." "Oh, no," I said, my heart sinking. "Please don't tell me the napkins are the wrong shade of beige." She did not laugh. "This is serious," she said, her eyes full of a pained and a deeply theatrical sincerity. "It's about the photographs and the visual harmony of the bridal party." She gestured for me to come and look at the swatches. On the bed was a piece of blush pink taffeta, the material of our hideous bridesmaid dresses. And next to it, the photographer had placed a series of different color-graded photographs. "JP here was just explaining to me," she said, her voice a low, sad murmur, "about the way that different colors can clash, about the way that certain tones, can create a jarring and an unprofessional visual narrative." I just stared at her, a cold and a deeply, deeply unpleasant feeling beginning to creep up my spine. I had a terrible sinking feeling that I knew where this was going. "The problem, Helen," she finally said, her eyes filling with a set of beautiful and entirely fraudulent tears, "is your hair." I just looked at her, my hair, my beautiful, long, and deeply, deeply unapologetic silver hair. "It's not that it isn't beautiful for your age," she continued, her voice now a gentle and a deeply, deeply patronizing purr. "It is. It's very striking. But," she took a deep, shuddering breath as if the words were causing her a profound physical pain, "it clashes terribly with the bashful peony of the dresses. It creates a gray and a deeply aging tonal value that it brings down the whole warm, romantic palette we've worked so hard to create." The photographer, JP, now chimed in, his voice a low, serious drone. "From a purely professional, chromatic perspective," he said, as if he were a surgeon discussing a terminal diagnosis, "the high-contrast, cool tone of your silver hair will be a visually disruptive element. It will, I'm afraid, draw the eye in all the group photos. It will age the entire bridal party. Age the entire bridal party." I stared at him, at his stupid, self-important man bun, at his ridiculous all-black artist's outfit. And then I looked back at my sister, at her beautiful, tear-streaked, and deeply, deeply monstrous face. "So what exactly are you suggesting, Ashley?" I asked, my voice a quiet and a very, very dangerous thing. "Well," she said, wringing her hands in a performance of pure sisterly agony, "I was thinking, and JP agrees, that the best and the simplest solution would be for you to just diet." "Diet?" I repeated, my voice a flat, dead thing. "Yes," she said, her voice now a bright and a deeply relieved thing, as if she had just solved a complex and a deeply unpleasant mathematical equation. "Just for the wedding, a nice, simple, uniform brown to match the other girls. It would create a much more cohesive and a much more elegant visual story. A story of youth and of romance and of warmth." I looked at her, at my half-sister, the little girl I had held in my arms as a baby, the young woman I had loved, and I felt a profound and a deeply, deeply clarifying sense of a final and an absolute break. This was not about a color. This was not about a photograph. This was about a deep and a cruel and a profoundly, profoundly selfish act of erasure. She was asking me to erase my age, to erase my history, to erase my very identity, for the sake of her stupid and her deeply, deeply meaningless wedding aesthetic. The ultimatum, no, I said. The word was not a shout, was a quiet and a deeply, deeply final thing. Ashley's tearful, pleading face immediately hardened. The mask of the loving, concerned sister fell away, revealing the cold, hard, and deeply tyrannical face of the bridezilla beneath. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice a low hiss. "I said no, Ashley," I repeated, my own voice now a calm and a wonderfully, beautifully free thing. "I am not dyeing my hair. It is a ridiculous and a deeply, deeply insulting request." "Insulting?" she shrieked, her voice now a high and a deeply unattractive thing. "I am trying to save you from embarrassing yourself and from ruining my wedding photos, and you are calling me insulting." "Yes," I said. "I am." We stood there in the middle of her beautiful, sun-drenched, and now deeply, deeply hostile bridal suite, a silent and a final battle of wills. "Fine," she finally spat, her face a mask of pure, ugly, and unrestrained rage. "Fine. Then you have a choice. You can either dye your hair a respectable, normal color, and you can be my maid of honor, or you can keep your old lady ghost hair, and you can come to my wedding as a guest. But you will not be in my bridal party. You will not be in my photos, and you will not stand next to me at the altar. It is your choice." She had given me an ultimatum, a final and a deeply, deeply foolish one. She thought she was trapping me. She thought she was leaving me with an impossible and a deeply humiliating choice. She had no idea, of course. She had no idea that she had just, in her profound and her deeply, deeply arrogant stupidity, handed me a third, and a far more interesting option. I looked at her furious, blotchy, and deeply, deeply ugly face, and I smiled. A real, genuine, and a deeply, deeply satisfied smile. "Thank you for clarifying my options, Ashley," I said, my voice a sweet and a deeply, deeply dangerous thing. "I will, of course, need a little time to think about it." I turned and I walked out of her room, leaving her standing there, a small and a deeply, deeply confused and a soon-to-be very, very sorry little tyrant. The time for appeasement was over. The time for a quiet and a deeply, deeply satisfying act of malicious compliance had just begun. The Ashes, 1975, the first week of my new, unemployed life, was a study in paralysis. I would sit on the lumpy floral print sofa in our small apartment in the village, the cardboard box of my former professional life on the floor in front of me, and I would just stare. The box contained a coffee mug, a thesaurus, 3 half-empty notepads, and the desiccated remains of a potted plant. It was a pathetic, tangible summary of a career that had been, in the space of a 10-minute conversation, completely and totally liquidated. My mind would replay Dawn's final words on a relentless, torturous loop. "Your priorities are about to change. Maggie, woman's place is at home with her baby. You should be thanking me." He had not just fired me. He had, with a casual, paternalistic cruelty, tried to define the entire future of my existence. He had tried to write my story for me. I was to be a mother, a wife, a happy domestic creature who would one day look back on her brief, brilliant career as a silly, youthful folly. The rage I felt was so profound, so all-consuming that it had no place to go. It was a silent, internal, and deeply impotent scream. My husband Jack was my rock. He would come home from his long, thankless days of teaching Shakespeare to apathetic teenagers, and he would find me, still on the sofa, a ghost in a bathrobe. He did not tell me to cheer up. He did not tell me to get over it. He would just sit with me in the quiet and hold my hand. He's a fool, Megs. He'd said one evening after I had recounted the entire sordid story for the 10th time. He's a dinosaur, and he is terrified of you. He didn't fire you because you were pregnant. He fired you because you were better than him, and your pregnancy gave him a socially acceptable excuse to get rid of the competition. His words were a small, bright light in my dark, self-pitying fog. He was right. Don's actions were not just an act of misogyny. They were an act of profound professional cowardice. He wasn't trying to protect me. He was trying to protect himself. It was Jack who, on the 5th night of my professional wake, came home with a bottle of cheap champagne and 2 glasses. "What's this for?" I'd asked, my voice a dull monotone. "It's a celebration," he'd said, popping the cork. "We are toasting the birth of your new company." I had just stared at him. "What are you talking about? I don't have a company." "Of course you do," he'd said, handing me a glass. "You are the most brilliant, most creative, and most ferociously determined person I have ever met. Sterling Cooper Shaw and Partners did not own your talent, Maggie. They were just renting it. And now your lease is up. So you are going to take that brilliant mind of yours and you are going to build your own damn house." He had raised his glass to the founder and CEO of whatever the hell you decide to call it. And in that moment, the grief, the rage, the profound sense of victimhood, it all began to recede. Burned away by the bright, hot, and wonderfully clarifying fire of a new idea. He was right. I was not a victim. It was an opportunity. Phoenix, I'd whispered the word, a sudden, perfect inspiration. Phoenix Advertising. A creature that is reborn from its own ashes, stronger than before. Jack had grinned, his entire face lighting up. To Phoenix, he'd said. We had clinked our glasses. And the first small and deeply defiant brick of my new empire had been laid. Underscore. The first spark, 1976, my first office was the small, wobbly card table in the corner of our dining room. My first piece of office equipment was a rented IBM Selectric typewriter that hummed with a sound I found deeply, wonderfully comforting. I was 3 months pregnant, my body in a state of constant low-grade nausea, and I went to work. My strategy was simple. I had no reputation. I had no capital. But I had one invaluable and deeply powerful asset. I had the truth. I knew the inner workings of my former agency. I knew which clients were unhappy, which accounts were being neglected by lazy, overpaid account executives, and which products were being saddled with mediocre, uninspired creative. And I knew that Don Shaw, for all his genius, had one fatal flaw: his arrogance. He was so convinced of his own brilliance that he had become complacent. My first target was a small, family-owned company that made a line of high-end, artisanal jams and jellies. They were a wonderful client, but they were small potatoes to an agency like SCSP, and I knew they were being consistently ignored. I had, with my own money, created a new, beautiful, and deeply elegant print ad campaign for them. The concept was simple: a spoonful of Sunday morning any day of the week. I had called the owner, a kind elderly man named Mr. Rossi, and I had begged him for a 10-minute meeting. I had shown up at his small, cramped office in Queens, a very pregnant and a very determined 25-year-old woman with a single portfolio under her arm. I had pitched him my campaign. He looked at my work, then at me, and he had fired Sterling Cooper Shaw and Partners on the spot. He had hired Phoenix Advertising. My first client, my first victory. The months that followed were a blur of work and hope and the strange, wonderful, and often terrifying process of my own personal creation. I would spend my days on the phone, a lonely one-woman agency, trying to drum up new business. I would spend my nights at the card table, my belly growing larger, my typewriter clacking away as I wrote the copy that was, I knew, the best work of my life. My daughter, Sarah, was born on a cold, bright morning in January of 1976. I remember holding her in my arms in the hospital bed. Tiny, perfect and deeply miraculous little creature, and I felt a surge of love so fierce, so profound, that it rearranged my entire universe. The revenge I was planning against Don Shah, I realized in that moment, was no longer just about my own wounded pride. It was about her. It was about building a world, a future. For this little girl, a world where her mother was not a victim, but a victor. A world where she would know from the day she was born that a woman's life, her ambition, was not a thing to be extinguished by the casual, condescending cruelty of a man. Building Phoenix, the 1980s, the first few years of Phoenix advertising were a brutal and a deeply beautiful struggle. My life was a chaotic, sleep-deprived, and wonderful juggling act. I was a mother, and I was a CEO. I would be on a conference call with a potential client, my voice a mask of cool professional competence while I was bouncing a colicky, crying baby on my knee. I would be up until 3 a.m, not with a sick child, but with a looming deadline, a bottle of baby formula on one side of my typewriter, a cup of black coffee on the other. But I was not alone. The story of my firing and of my defiant one-woman stand had become a quiet, whispered legend among the other women in the advertising industry, and they began to find their way to me. My first hire was a brilliant Tough Faznals media buyer named Susan, a woman who had been passed over for a promotion at her own male-dominated firm in favor of a less qualified man. My second hire was a genius of an art director named Helen, a woman who had been told by her own boss that her style was too emotional. I did not set out to build an all-female agency. I had simply set out to hire the best, most talented, and most undervalued people in the business. And in the New York of the late 1970s and early 1980s, those people, almost without exception, were women. Our small apartment became our headquarters. My living room was our conference room. Our dining room table was our bullpen. And we were a force. We were a scrappy, hungry, and deeply, deeply motivated team of creative assassins. And we were winning. We took on the clients no one else wanted, the difficult ones, the small ones, and we made them shine. We built our reputation not on the size of our clients, but on the quality of our work. And slowly, word began to spread. The big agencies, the old boys club of Madison Avenue, started to look over their shoulders. Who was this upstart, all-female agency that was suddenly winning all the creative awards? The turning point, the moment we went from a scrappy underdog to a legitimate contender, came in 1985. We won the Coca-Cola account. Not the whole thing, but a new, experimental campaign for a new product called Diet Coke. Our pitch had been a wild, audacious, and deeply female-centric campaign that was unlike anything the company had ever done before. Don Shah's agency had pitched for the same account. Their pitch, I had heard, had been a tired, predictable rehash of their old classic Coke campaigns. We had one. I had beaten him for the first time, on a level playing field. That was the year we finally moved into a real office, a beautiful, sun-drenched loft space in Soho. I remember standing in the middle of the empty, cavernous space, the smell of fresh paint in the air, my daughter Sarah, now a bright, curious 9-year-old, holding my hand. And I had felt a sense of pride so profound, so absolute, that it almost brought me to my knees. We had built this from nothing, a new era, the 1990s. The 90s were a decade of explosive growth. The world was changing. The internet was coming. And Phoenix Advertising, an agency built on a foundation of scrappy outsider thinking, was perfectly positioned to ride the wave. We understood the new, emerging culture in a way that the old, monolithic, and deeply conservative agencies, like Sterling Cooper Shaw and Partners, simply could not. They were still making ads for a world that no longer existed. A world of happy, stay-at-home mothers and pipe-smoking, patriarchal fathers. We were making ads for a world that was messy and complicated and funny and real. We hired the best, brightest, and most diverse talent we could find. Our agency was a beautiful, chaotic, and deeply creative meritocracy. The ultimate public validation of our success came in 1998. It was at the Clio Awards, the Oscars of the advertising world. Held at a massive, glittering ballroom in New York, Phoenix Advertising was nominated for Agency of the Year, and so was my old firm, Sterling Cooper Shaw and Partners. I sat at a table with my team, a group of 50 of the most brilliant, creative, and wonderful people I had ever known. My daughter Sarah, now a sharp, funny, and deeply impressive college student who was interning with us for the summer, was sitting beside me when the presenter opened the envelope and announced that the winner of the Agency of the Year was Phoenix Advertising. The roar from our table was deafening. I looked across the ballroom and I saw him. Don Shaw. He was sitting at his own table, a table of old gray-faced men in ill-fitting tuxedos. He was looking at me, and on his face for the first time I saw not pity, not condescension, but a look of pure, unadulterated, and deeply, deeply satisfying defeat. He was no longer the king, he was a relic. And I was the future. I walked up to that stage, my heart a triumphant drum. I accepted the heavy gold statue, and I looked out at the crowd, at the entire glittering world of the industry that had once so casually and so cruelly discarded me. I was once told, I said, my voice clear and strong, that a woman's place was at home. And I would just like to say from the bottom of my heart to the man who gave me that advice, thank you. You were the inspiration for everything that came after. I did not have to say his name. Everyone in that room knew exactly who I was talking about. I walked off that stage, the applause a thunderous wave at my back. The victory was sweet. But I knew even then that it was not the end of the story. It was just the end of the second act. The final, quiet, and most satisfying act of my revenge, I knew, was still to come. And it would be a revenge that was not one on a stage with a gold statue, but in a silent and a deeply, deeply hostile corporate boardroom. The wounded giant, the new millennium, arrived, not with a bang, but with the quiet, terrifying hum of a dial-up modem. The world was changing, and the advertising industry was at the epicenter of the quake. The internet was a new, wild, and deeply democratic frontier. It's a place where the old rules of media and marketing no longer applied. And the first, a woman who had built her empire on the foundation of being an outsider, was ready for it. My agency, Phoenix Advertising, thrived in this new chaos. We embraced the digital age. We hired young, brilliant, and deeply weird tech nerds. We created the first viral marketing campaigns. We were nimble, we were smart, and we were fearless. Sterling Cooper Shaw and Partners, on the other hand, was not Don Shaw's agency, the great monolithic and deeply arrogant institution of my youth, was now a wounded giant. Don, who was now in his 60s and then his 70s, saw the internet not as an opportunity, but as an insult. He did not understand it, and so he dismissed it. I would read his interviews in Ad Age and Adweek, and they were the sad, almost comical ramblings of a man who was desperately, and with a profound lack of self-awareness, clinging to a world that was already gone. He would pontificate on the timeless power of a good, clean 30-second television spot, while the rest of the world was talking about banner ads and search engine optimization. His agency, once the undisputed king of Madison Avenue, began to hemorrhage clients. The big, modern, forward-thinking companies did not want to work with a man who still thought a successful campaign was measured in column inches in the New York Times. They were losing ground, year by year, becoming less of a powerhouse and more of a punchline. I watched their slow, pathetic decline with a kind of cold and a deeply, deeply satisfying detachment. My revenge, the one I had won on the stage of the Clio Awards, had been a public validation of my talent. But my final and my most complete Revenge, I decided, would be a quiet and a deeply, deeply hostile act of corporate acquisition. A new kind of war. My revenge, up until this point, had been about building a better company. Now, it was about buying the one that had cast me out. It was no longer an emotional crusade. It was a business strategy. It was the final, logical, and deeply satisfying end to a 50-year-long story. I called a meeting in my office with my two most trusted lieutenants, Susan, my CFO, a brilliant, numbers-obsessed woman who had been with me since the 1980s, and Ben, my head of legal, a quiet, terrifyingly intelligent man who had orchestrated some of the most complex corporate mergers in our industry. I laid out my plan. It was simple. It was audacious. And it was, by all accounts, completely and utterly insane. I want to buy Sterling Cooper Shaw and Partners, I said. They just stared at me. Susan was the first to speak. Maggie, she said, her voice a careful, diplomatic thing. With all due respect, why? It's a failing company. Their client list is shrinking, their debt-to-equity ratio is a disaster, and their entire business model is obsolete. It's a sinking ship. Why would we want to buy a sinking ship? Because, I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. I was the one who built that ship in the first place. And I have a vested and a deeply personal interest in presiding over its final, official decommissioning. Ben, the lawyer, just nodded slowly, a look of dawning and a deeply appreciative understanding in his eyes. He got it. This was not a business decision. This was a war trophy. It would have to be a hostile takeover, he said, his mind already working through the logistics. Don still owns a controlling interest. He would never agree to a sale. Not to you. I'm not going to ask him. I said, we are not going to make a formal offer. Not yet. We are going to conduct a quiet, slow, and deeply patient campaign of a different sort. We are going to buy him piece by piece over the next 20 years. We are going to become a ghost in his machine. And by the time he realizes what has happened, he will be living in a house that we already own. Underscore the ghost in the machine, and so began the long game. The final and most satisfying act of my 50-year-long revenge. It was a game of corporate chess played on a global scale over a period of almost 2 decades. And I was the only person in the world who knew that the game was even being played. My first move was in 2008. The world was on fire. The great financial crisis had brought the global economy to its knees. And I, a creature born from fire, was ready. I knew that SCSP, like most of the old agencies, was heavily leveraged. They had a massive line of corporate debt with one of the big investment banks that was now itself on the verge of collapse. Through a newly created and completely anonymous subsidiary of Phoenix Global based in Delaware, a shell corporation. With a name so boring it was practically invisible. Mid-Atlantic Capital Ventures, I went to that bank. And I bought their debt. I bought all of it, for pennies on the dollar. It was a risky, aggressive move, but it was a brilliant one. With that single, quiet transaction, I had, without Don Shaw even knowing it, become his banker. I was the one who now owned the mortgage on his entire crumbling empire. The next phase was the slow, patient, and almost meditative acquisition of their stock. SCSP was a publicly traded but a family-controlled company. Don and his small, insular board of old, gray-faced men owned a majority of the shares. But the rest were traded on the open market. Over the next 15 years, I used a dozen different anonymous and globally distributed shell corporations and investment funds to slowly, quietly buy up every single share of their stock I could get my hands on. 1,000 shares here, through a fund in the Cayman Islands called Orion Holdings. Another 5,000 there, through a holding company in Switzerland named Viridian Group. It was a slow, steady, and completely untraceable process. I was a shark, circling a bleeding animal, taking a small, imperceptible bite every few months, slowly, patiently, waiting for it to grow weak. Life interrupted this long, quiet, and deeply satisfying war. Was the background radiation of my life. But it was not my life. My life was my daughter, Sarah, who had grown into a brilliant and a successful woman in her own right. A doctor who was far more interested in healing people than in selling them things. My life was the birth of my 2 grandchildren, who filled my world with a kind of joy that made the old, bitter taste of my revenge seem like a distant and an almost insignificant thing. I would sit on the floor of my daughter's living room, playing with my grandchildren, and my phone would buzz with a notification from my broker in Zurich, confirming another small purchase of SCSP stock. And I would smile. I had done what Don Shaw had told me was impossible. I had built my empire, and I had built my family. And the two were not at war with each other. They were 2 separate and beautiful parts of a whole, and a deeply, deeply satisfying life. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in the fall of 2024. SCSP, which was now a pathetic, hollowed-out shell of its former glory, made a final desperate attempt to save itself. They issued a new round of stock to raise capital. And my anonymous international network of shell corporations, the quiet, patient ghosts I had created, bought all of it. Underscore the final move I called a special meeting of the Phoenix Global Board of Directors in December of 2024. I had a single slide prepared for my presentation. It was a complex, beautiful, and deeply satisfying chart that showed the ownership structure of Sterling Cooper Shaw and Partners. It showed a dozen different anonymous entities. And it showed that, when you added them all together, they all pointed back to a single controlling owner. Me, through my various and my completely invisible holdings. I, Margaret Collins, now owned 51% of the company that had fired me 50 years ago for the crime of having a baby. I looked at the stunned, awestruck faces of my own loyal board members. For the past 25 years, I said, my voice a calm, quiet, and deeply satisfied thing, we have been engaged in a quiet, strategic, and a deeply personal acquisition. The company is ours, but Don Shaw does not yet know it. I leaned forward, and now I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face, it is time for us to make our position known. Tomorrow morning, we will be initiating a formal, illegal, and a deeply, deeply hostile takeover of Sterling Cooper Shaw and Partners. And I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, will be personally overseeing the transition. The long game was over. The checkmate, 50 years in the making, was about to be called. And the ghost in the machine was, finally, after all these years, about to show her face. The hostile takeover of Sterling Cooper Shaw and Partners, was not a long, protracted war, was a swift, silent, and deeply impersonal execution. My team of lawyers and financial analysts at Phoenix Global, the corporate assassins I had spent decades cultivating, descended upon the weakened, bleeding company with a brutal and beautiful efficiency. Don Shaw and his board of old, frightened men tried to fight, of course. They issued a defiant press release, full of blustering, outdated language about their storied history and their unwavering commitment to creative independence. They tried to find a white knight investor to save them, but it was hopeless. I owned their debt. I owned a majority of their stock, and I owned their future. The battle was over before it had even begun. Within 3 weeks, the deal was done. Phoenix Global had officially, and with a great deal of legal finality, acquired 100% of the assets of my former employer, the company that had fired me for the crime of being pregnant. The company that had tried to erase me from its history was now in the final, glorious accounting. Just another small and a deeply insignificant subsidiary on my own vast corporate balance sheet. I did not make a grand, triumphant announcement. I did not issue a press release. For the first 2 weeks after the acquisition was finalized, I did nothing. I let the silence and the terror of the unknown fester in the halls of the Pan Am building. I let them wonder. I let them sweat. I let Don Shaw, a man who had once been the undisputed king of his own small universe, sit in his corner office and contemplate the terrifying and the deeply humiliating reality of his own new and powerless position. Then, on a crisp, clear morning in early 2025, 50 years after I had walked out of that building with my life, in a cardboard box, I decided it was time to return. The return. The offices of Sterling Cooper Shaw and Partners were on the 42nd floor, just as they had been. But the agency I walked into was not the agency I remembered. The vibrant, chaotic, and deeply, deeply alive place I had once known was gone. In its place was a museum of a dead idea. The air no longer smelled of cigarette smoke and ambition. It smelled of dust and of quiet, managed decline. The one's modern furniture was now worn, its leather cracked, its chrome pitted. The dark wood-paneled walls, which had once felt like a symbol of power, now just felt old. The few employees who were scattered around the half-empty office looked up as I walked in, their faces a mixture of fear and a dull, listless curiosity. They were the skeletal crew of a ghost ship, and they were just waiting for the order to finally abandon it. I did not speak to anyone. I just walked, my footsteps a loud alien sound on the worn carpet through the quiet, sad office. I walked past the desk where I had once sat, the desk where I had written the campaign that had been my masterpiece. And I walked to the end of the hall, to the large oak door of the corner office. The office that had once been his. The office that was now, by right of conquest, mine. I did not knock. I just opened the door, the boardroom, had requested that he meet me in the main boardroom, the place where he had fired me. It was, I felt, a fitting venue for the final, and the most important meeting of both of our careers. I was there first. I stood by the large plate glass window, looking out at the same magnificent and unchanging view of the Manhattan skyline. The room was exactly as I remembered it. The same long mahogany table, the same uncomfortable-looking chairs, same faint, ghostly smell of my own 50-year-old humiliation. The door opened, and he walked in. Don Shaw, at 92, was a ghost of his former self. The handsome, charismatic, and powerful man who had been my mentor, my tormentor, and my inspiration was gone. In his place was a frail, stooped, and deeply, deeply old man. His expensive suit hung off his shrunken frame. His hands, which had once been so full of a confident, expressive energy, were now gnarled with arthritis and trembled slightly. He looked at me, his faded, watery blue eyes full of a confused and a deeply, deeply weary fear. "Margaret," he said, his voice a dry, reedy rasp. "Don," I replied, my own voice a calm, quiet, and utterly merciless thing. "Please, sit down." He shuffled over to the long table and sat, a small, hunched figure at the opposite end of the vast, polished expanse. He looked like a child who had been called to the principal's office. I did not sit. I remained standing by the window, a silent, powerful figure silhouetted against the bright morning sky. I let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable minute. I let him sit with his fear. "Do you remember this room, Don?" I finally asked, my voice a soft, conversational purr. "Of course," he whispered. "I do," I said. "I remember it very well. I remember standing right here in this very spot, a 25-year-old girl, so full of a blind, stupid, and a deeply misplaced faith in you. And I remember you sitting where you are sitting now and telling me that my career was over because I was going to have a baby." He just stared at his hands, which were trembling on the table. "You told me," continued, my voice still a quiet, relentless monologue that my place was at home. You told me my priorities were about to change. You told me I should be, thanking you for setting me free from the burdens of my own ambition. I began to walk, slowly, deliberately, along the length of the long table towards him. And I have often wondered, I said, my footsteps the only sound in the silent room. If you have ever, in the 50 years since that day, had any idea of what you truly set free? I started my own company, Don, in the dining room of my tiny, fifth-floor walk-up apartment. I was 6 months pregnant. I had a rented typewriter, a telephone, and a single, radical, and apparently deeply offensive idea that a woman's mind did not, in fact, cease to function the moment her womb became occupied. I was standing beside him now, looking down. At the top of his bowed white head, my company was called Phoenix Advertising, and it was built on a foundation of every single, brilliant, and deeply talented woman that you and men like you had dismissed, had underestimated, and had cast aside. It was built on the ashes of the careers you had tried to burn to the ground. And we, in turn, burned your world to the ground. I walked back to the window. We won the Coca-Cola account. We won the Clio. We embraced the digital age while you were still trying to figure out how to work a fax machine. We did not just build a company, Don. We built the future. And you became a relic, a sad, pathetic, and deeply, deeply irrelevant museum piece. I finally turned from the window to look at him. His face was a pale, slack mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He had, I realized, never once in all these years considered the story from my perspective. Underscore, the final word die walked to the head of the table, to the large leather chair that had always been his. And I sat down. And now I said, my voice no longer a whisper, but the clear, confident, and utterly final voice of the chairman of the board of Phoenix Global, the new owner of this sad and this deeply, deeply bankrupt little company. I have acquired you, your history, your legacy, your entire mismanaged and deeply obsolete little world. It all belongs to me now. I looked at him, at the frail, pathetic, and deeply, deeply old man who had once been my God. And I felt no pity, I felt no anger. I felt only the quiet, clean, and deeply satisfying click of a 50-year-old ledger finally. And completely being balanced, I leaned forward, my hands clasped on the croissant, and I delivered the final and the most beautifully, poetically just line of my entire 50-year-long career. I gave him back the words he had given to me. The words that had been the fuel for my entire life's fire. Dawn, my voice a soft and a deeply, deeply merciless thing. I've reviewed your long and storied performance, and I've decided that your priorities need to change. I paused, letting the words land, letting him feel the full, crushing, and deeply familiar weight of them. Your place is at home, I said. You're fired. I watched as the last tiny, flickering light of his own personal pride was finally and completely extinguished. He did not speak. He just crumpled, a slow, silent, and an internal collapse. I stood up. My work here was done. The ghost of the 25-year-old girl I had once been had, after 50 long years, finally been avenged. I walked out of that boardroom, out of that office, and I did not look back. I had a new and a much bigger empire to run. And I had a new and a much better story to write. The story of what comes next. The ashes after Don Shaw was escorted from the building. A quiet and a deeply funereal silence settled over the 42nd floor. I was the new owner of a ghost ship. The company, Sterling Cooper Shaw and Partners, was a hollowed-out shell, a relic, of a bygone era with a handful of terrified, demoralized employees and a client list that had withered to almost nothing. My 50-year quest for revenge had been a stunning success. I had conquered the mountain. And now, standing alone at the summit, I had to decide what to do with the kingdom. I had just one. My first act as the new owner was to call a meeting with Rick. We had a meeting with the remaining staff, about 20 souls gathered in the main conference room, the same room where my career had been so brutally executed. They looked at me with a mixture of terror and a strange, morbid curiosity. I was the ghost from the past. The legendary Maggie Collins returned as a corporate conqueror. They were expecting a bloodbath. They were expecting me to fire them all, to sell the company for parts, to scrub its very name from the face of Madison Avenue as my final, vengeful act. I spent the next few days in a state of quiet, methodical assessment. I walked the halls of my old agency, a place that was at once intimately familiar and completely alien. The ghosts were everywhere. I saw the corner where my old desk had been. I saw the small, windowless office where I had cried after Don had stolen my first big idea. And I saw his office, the great corner throne room, now empty, its view of the city as silent testament to a fallen king. My initial and my most primal instinct was to do just as everyone expected. Destroy it, raze the entire rotten structure to the ground. It was a monument to a toxic, misogynistic past, a past that had almost destroyed me. The logical, business-minded CEO in me knew that the most profitable course of action was to simply liquidate the assets, absorb the 1 or 2 remaining decent accounts into my own larger agency, and be done with it. But the historian in me, the woman who understood the deep and complex power of a legacy, hesitated. To simply erase the company would be to erase the story. And my story, I realized, was now inextricably and deeply ironically tied to theirs, underscore a new foundation. My son, Jack, and my daughter, Sarah, flew in from their own successful lives to have dinner with me that weekend. I told them my dilemma. "Burn it to the ground, Mom," Jack had said, his voice full of a fierce, protective loyalty. "It's a toxic asset. It represents an era that needed to die. Don't let it be an anchor on your own legacy." But Sarah, my daughter, the baby whose very existence had been the catalyst for this entire 50-year-long war, had been quieter, more thoughtful. "What was the name of the original founder, Mom?" She'd asked. "The one before Don?" "Sterling." I'd said, "Arthur Sterling. A good, decent man who believed in the creative product above all else. So it's not Don's legacy, is it?" She'd said, her eyes full of a wisdom that made my heart ache with pride. "Not really. He was just the one who ran it into the ground, maybe. Maybe the point isn't to destroy the company. Maybe the point is to reclaim it, to turn it into something that honors the good parts of its history and fixes the bad." And in that moment, my daughter, my brilliant, beautiful, and deeply empathetic daughter, had given me the final and the most perfect piece of my own. Revenge. My revenge had never truly been about destroying Don Shaw. It had been about proving him wrong. It had been about proving that a woman, a mother, could not just survive in his world, but could build a better one. And now I had the ultimate opportunity to do just that. I called a meeting with my own board of directors at Phoenix Global the following week. And I made my proposal. We would not be absorbing Sterling Cooper Shaw and Partners. We would not be liquidating its assets. We would be transforming it. Underscore the cornerstone, the plan I laid out was simple. And it was radical. We would dissolve the old corrupted corporate entity of SCSP, and we would use its remaining assets, its office space, its brand recognition, its remaining capital to create something new. I stood before my board, a 75-year-old woman at the absolute peak of her power, and I announced the birth of my final and my greatest project. We are going to create the Sarah Collins Foundation for Women in Business. I had announced, my voice ringing with a 50-year-old purpose. I looked at my daughter, who was sitting in the front row, her own eyes shining with tears. This foundation, I had explained, will not be a traditional ad agency. It will be a nonprofit incubator, a mentorship program, and a venture capital fund dedicated to one simple mission: to support, to fund, and to champion the next generation of female entrepreneurs, particularly working mothers. The foundation I had laid out would use the old 42nd floor office of SCSP as its headquarters. It would provide grants, office space, and, most importantly, the kind of high-level strategic mentorship from the senior executives at my own company that I had been so brutally denied. We would find the brilliant, ambitious, and undervalued women who were being told by the Dawn Shaws of the world that their priorities needed to change. And we would give them the one thing I had never had: a support system, a network, a foundation. My revenge, in its final glorious form, was not to be an act of destruction. It was to be an act of creation. It was going to take the very place where my own career had been so cruelly kneecapped, and I was going to transform it into a launching pad for 1,000 other women's dreams. Underscore. The legacy is a year later now. I am standing in a room that is both deeply familiar and completely, beautifully unrecognizable. It is the old main boardroom of Sterling Cooper Shaw and Partners. But the dark, heavy mahogany table is gone. The smoke-stained, wood-paneled walls have been replaced with bright, open glass. The room is full of light, of energy, of the chaotic, happy sounds of 100 brilliant women talking, laughing, and building the future. We are at the first annual award ceremony for the Sarah Collins Foundation, and I am on the stage about to present the foundation's main grant, a $1 million seed investment, to our first ever recipient. Her name is Maria. She is a brilliant 28-year-old software engineer, and she is 8 months pregnant. She has a game-changing idea for a new piece of educational software. And she, like me, had been told by her own modern-day version of Dawn Shaw that her priorities needed to change. I look at her bright, intelligent, and fiercely determined face, and I see a reflection, a ghost. The ghost of the 25-year-old girl I had once been, the one who had stood in this very same building and had been told that her life was over. But the world is different now, 'cause I and women, like me, had made it different. I announce her name. The room erupts in a roar of joyous, supportive applause. She walks to the stage, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, and she accepts the oversized check from me, her eyes shining with a gratitude so profound it makes my own heart ache with a kind of beautiful, circular, and deeply satisfying joy. My revenge is complete. I look out at the room, at the sea of brilliant, ambitious, and powerful women, and I see that my real legacy is not the skyscraper that bears my company's name. It is this room, this foundation, this new and this better world. Dawn Shaw had tried to send me home, and in the end I had taken his home and I had turned it into a launching pad for 1,000 other women to reach for the stars. And that, I knew, was a story with a much, much better ending.